Mr. Speaker, last year the California Air Resources Board proposed a new regulation that would have disastrous consequences for my constituents, for the people of California, and for the people of the United States. This so-called in-use locomotive rule would phase out the use of diesel-electric locomotives and require all locomotives entering the state of California to do so in a zero-emission configuration within just a few short years. Mr. Speaker, there are several problems with this regulation. The first and most obvious is that there are currently no electric locomotives that can take the place of a diesel-electric freight locomotive. In fact, the best electric locomotives that exist currently are those so-called switch locomotives that are used to move cars back and forth between trains within freight switch yards. There are no locomotives that can take the place of a diesel-electric locomotive and haul millions of pounds of freight from place to place over hundreds of miles. And Mr. Speaker, the physics suggest there will be no locomotives that can accomplish this anytime in the near future. Requiring this regulation would raise prices for every consumer in California, a state, Mr. Speaker, which already suffers the worst poverty of any state in the country. But, Mr. Speaker, this would also have a disastrous effect on my constituents. B&S Railways is currently constructing a $1.5 billion project in the city of Barstow within my district, an intermodal transfer facility that will allow freight from the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach to be shipped by rail to Barstow and then transshipped by rail or by truck to other places in the country. Currently, Mr. Speaker, that freight leaves those ports on trucks. BNSF have said, quite reasonably, that if California will not let their locomotives enter the state, they will abandon their plans for that intermodal transfer facility. Mr. Speaker, that will result in the loss of not just $1.5 billion of investment in my community, but over 20,000 jobs in the region of California that I represent. But, Mr. Speaker, the most nonsensical part of this regulation is that it actually will be much worse for the environment. It is 3 times more efficient to transport freight by rail than it is by truck. That's 1/3 the amount of greenhouse gases emitted into the atmosphere. If we force freight to be shipped by truck instead of by rail out of the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, that would be far worse for the environment than allowing it to be transported on the efficient diesel-electric locomotives that we currently have. That is why this amendment would deny the EPA the funding that they need to grant a waiver to the state of California to implement this nonsensical rule. I urge adoption of this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. The gentlewoman. 5 minutes. What purpose does the gentlewoman rise?
A request time in opposition to this
The
amendment.
gentlewoman from Maine is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in opposition to this amendment, which would effectively bar the EPA from approving a waiver of federal preemption for California's in-use locomotive rule. Congress carefully crafted the Clean Air Act to recognize the diverse air pollution challenges facing each state. Due to a history of severe air quality problems, the EPA can grant California waivers to set vehicle emission standards that are more protective than those at the federal level, including for locomotives. While the EPA retains the authority to promulgate emission standards for new locomotives and locomotive engines, California is well within its rights to request a waiver of federal preemption for regulations having to do with existing or in-use locomotives and locomotive engines. Legal technicalities aside, this rule is critical to the public health and welfare of Californians and for residents of the states who may choose to adopt these stronger standards in the future, thanks to the flexibilities embedded in the Clean Air Act. Diesel-powered locomotives emit dangerous air pollutants, including particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, and greenhouse gases. Exposure to this toxic and harmful pollution has been linked to cancer, asthma, cardiopulmonary illnesses, reproductive health harm, and premature mortality. California's rule is expected to prevent 3,200 premature deaths, 1,100 hospital admissions, and 1,500 emergency room visits, and deliver $32 billion in health savings. For California communities living near rail yards, this rule is projected to decrease cancer risk by over 90%. This amendment is yet another Republican attack on EPA's authority to protect public health from sources of dangerous pollution, and simply another item on their polluters over people agenda. A no vote on this amendment is a vote for protecting public health and preserving states' rights under the Clean Air Act. I urge my colleagues to side with the law and with science, and I oppose this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very glad my colleague from Maine brought up the Clean Air Act, because the Clean Air Act explicitly says that the right to set emissions requirements for locomotives is preempted from the states. And Mr. Speaker, that makes complete sense, because how on earth can we operate a national railway system if we allow each of the 50 states to come up with their own rules about what locomotives can cross their state lines? Mr. Speaker, that is a complete impossibility. And to remind my colleague from Maine, the most nonsensical part of this rule is that these locomotives, these replacement electric motives, do not exist, and they are not likely to exist anytime in the near future. The current best battery technology that we possess can store about 5 megawatts of energy in the form factor of a locomotive. And Mr. Speaker, to replace an existing freight locomotive would require about 20 times that amount of energy, about 100 megawatts of energy. Mr. Speaker, this is a nonsensical rule. It's bad for the people of California. It is bad for consumers in California. It's bad for the people of the United States, because this rule would result in more greenhouse gas emissions, not less. I urge adoption of this common sense amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.